Team Group Dark Z Alpha is a high-performance DDR4 memory that features an armored aluminum heatsink design, comes with an overclocking profile, and is compatible with AMD's latest Ryzen processors. To learn more, check out the link in the video description. In today's video, we're going to be doing something I've been wanting to do for a very long time. We're going to be comparing the i3-3240 to the FX-6300, both of which released back in 2012, only a month apart from each other. The FX-6300 is a 6-core part that you could get for $132, while the i3-3240 is a dual-core CPU with 4 threads that was priced a little higher at $147. And today we're going to have a look at how these CPUs performed over the years. Basically, we're going to compare them in plenty of games that released within the last decade to see which one was a better choice back then and which one has aged better as time went on. Now, the reason I've been wanting to do this is because over the past 7 to 8 years, I've been immensely interested into PCs, mostly into CPUs. So I'd spend a lot of my time checking out reviews and playing around with hardware whenever I had the opportunity to do so. I'd disable cores on a high core count CPU, underclock it, then I would set everything back to default, and of course while at it I'd launch a game, do some testing here and there, after which I'd sit down and compare those results. Obviously, I was starting to understand things more and more, and as I kept doing what I was doing, I began to realize something. That something is the main inspiration behind one of my previous videos, this video as well as a few upcoming ones. It is also the reason why my gaming results are shown as the actual gameplay footage with all the necessary information, cause I want you to see where and how I'm doing my testing, how the system behaves under those conditions, etc, etc. So let's dive in and let me show you what I'm talking about. Looking at system specs, we're using a 990 FXA UD3 Revision 4 motherboard for the FX-6300 and a Z77A G43 for the i3-3240, 16GB of DDR3 1866 MHz memory, an overclocked GTX 970 graphics card, and a 700-watt FSP Hydro power supply. When it comes to cooling, both CPUs are being cooled using the out-of-the-box coolers, which we will talk about later in the video. All the games were tested using lowest settings at a resolution of 1600 by 900 to avoid any GPU bottlenecks, which shouldn't be a problem in this situation, though I still believe that using such settings with 8-year-old budget CPUs like these is a more realistic scenario. Also, since I did a fresh install of Windows before testing the i3-3240, I had to retest the FX-6300 completely, meaning that results might be slightly different compared to my previous videos. As always, let's begin with software benchmarks, after which we'll move on to gaming results. Starting off, we have Cinebench R15, where the i3-3240 has a single-core advantage of 29%, though when it comes to multi-core, the FX-6300 pulls ahead by 38%. For a 6-core CPU that also has a higher frequency, these results may seem disappointing, though since the FX-6300 is $15 cheaper, I don't think there is much to complain about. Remember, the FX processors have an unconventional architecture. They share some parts in them which impacts performance a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a 6-core processor. That is a subject we're going to be talking about in the future as well, so make sure to ring that notification bell. Next up, we have Blender, where the FX-6300 takes the lead in both BMW and classroom scenes by 14 and 23% respectively. Moving on, we have Corona, and here the FX-6300 outperforms the i3-3240 by 26%. Next, we have Vegas Pro 14, and once again the FX-6300 takes the lead by 23%. Looking at V-Ray, the 6-core FX beats the Core i3 once again, and this time by a massive 59% margin. 7-zip is yet another benchmark where the i3 falls behind its competitor. The FX-6300 outperforms the Ivy Bridge processor when it comes to both compression and decompression by 46 and 86% respectively. For our final software, we have Intel Burn Test, where the i3 actually takes the lead, outperforming the FX-6300 by 38%. Moving on to gaming, let's begin with older titles, and let me show you what I was talking about in the beginning of the video. First, we have Saints Row the Third, and here we can see the i3 easily outperforming the FX-6300 by 20 frames, at least when standing still. The difference can drop to around 5 to 15 frames once you start driving, though despite the frame rate disadvantage, the FX-6300 manages to deliver better frame time performance in this situation. This is the exact reason why I show my gaming results this way, because depending on what you do or where you're located at, the in-game performance might change drastically, which is something we're going to be talking about throughout the video. Next up, we have Warhammer Space Marine, where we see an identical situation. Standing still, there is no way of telling the difference between the two, though when you get into some action, the i3 starts to fall behind by around 10 frames per second in a game that released 9 years ago. By the way, those sudden spikes that you see on the frame time graph happen whenever you kill an enemy, so it has nothing to do with the CPUs. Next on the list is Far Cry 3, where once again the i3 is a few frames ahead when standing still, and while both CPUs have a very identical frame rate when driving, the FX-6300 manages to deliver a slightly smoother experience. Crysis 2 is next, where the FX-6300 easily takes the cake, outperforming the i3-3240 by roughly 10 to 15 frames per second, while also delivering slightly more consistent frame times.
Firing! Lighting him up!
Next, we have Battlefield 3, and using the campaign mode, the experience is pretty much identical between the two. The i3 has a small FPS advantage, while the frame time performance is ever so slightly better on the FX-6300, though overall I don't think you'd be able to tell the difference between the two. Okay, so what about multiplayer? Well, I'm glad you asked, because results are slightly different than what you get in the campaign mode. Now, I want you to keep in mind that comparing two different CPUs is very difficult in multiplayer, but after spending a few hours playing on both processors, I can confirm that the FX-6300 does handle things better than the i3. The i3-3240 also tends to struggle from time to time, and even though something similar does also happen on the FX processor, it doesn't get as bad nor last as long as it does on the i3. Honestly, at first I thought it was a problem on my end, however once I installed an i5, the issue was gone and the game ran perfectly fine. Moving on, we have Crysis 3, where the FX-6300 is at least 20 frames ahead and is able to deliver a much smoother experience. By the way, if you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate if you could just simply leave a like. You can also use Amazon affiliate links for your personal purchases provided in the description, which also helps a ton. Looking at GTA 5, we can see that in simple situations, both are delivering identical performance, though once we start driving, we can easily pick a winner. To be honest, I expected the i3 to handle things better in older titles, especially because of how much single core was praised back in the days, but so far it seems like even back then it wasn't all about single core performance. By the way, the time it takes to jump from one character to the other is also longer on the i3, which is probably not something you'd care about, but hey, the more you know. Next up, we have Battlefield 4, where the FX-6300 easily outperforms the i3-3240 regardless of the situation. Remember, Battlefield 4 released back in 2013, just a year after both of these CPUs got launched, and the game is already unplayable on the Intel processor, at least when looking at multiplayer results. It is just crazy to think that the i3s had the exact same core count up until the end of 2017. It makes me believe that even an i3-6100 with DDR4 memory would struggle against the FX-6300 in this game, as well as most modern titles, and it's probably something we're going to check in the near future. Next on the list is Dying Light, and here the FX-6300 is performing around 7 to 10 frames better than the i3-3240. Moving on, we have Need for Speed 2015, where once again the FX-6300 has a 7 to 10 FPS advantage, which is a noticeable difference since the i3 frequently drops below 50 frames per second. Looking at Witcher 3 results, we see the i3 performing 10 to 15 FPS worse, and while the frame time is pretty good on the Intel processor when running in an open field, things get much worse once we step inside Novigrad, compared to the FX-6300 that handles everything without a problem. Also, pay attention that the i3 has been pretty much maxing out in most games we've tested up until this point, and what that basically means is you don't really have the option to multitask much. For example, you won't be able to talk to your friends through apps such as Discord without having communication issues. You're most likely going to get stutters and FPS drops, or experience things such as objects or NPCs not getting loaded properly. Because of that, it is always better to have more headroom, which is another area where the FX-6300 excels its competitor. Next up, we have Rainbow Six Siege, where both CPUs are performing very similarly to each other. Now, if you've seen my FX-6350 versus FX-6300 video, you've probably noticed that the stock FX-6300 is performing better here than it did in that comparison, and the reason for that is simply because the FX-6300 was accidentally tested using DirectX 12 instead of Vulkan. Today I can confirm that both CPUs have been tested using the Vulkan implementation, so these results are correct. For some reason, using the built-in benchmark, we see the FX-6300 beating the i3-3240 by around 15 to 20 frames, depending on the area, though I doubt you'll be able to tell the difference between 160 and 180 frames. For our next game, we have The Division, where the i3 is starting to seriously struggle. At first, it may seem like the Intel processor has the lead up until you notice that a lot of things aren't even loaded up, which obviously boosts performance. Once everything loads up, and it took a few runs for that to happen, we can see the i3 having a hard time keeping things stable. The FX-6300, on the other hand, has absolutely no issues running Division. Everything loads up just fine, and it performs significantly better compared to the Intel processor. Watch Dogs 2 is next, and here the FX-6300 is beating the i3 by around 10 to 15 frames per second, while also delivering a much smoother experience. Moving on, we have PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, which is yet another title that requires more than just 2 cores and 4 threads, and keep in mind that this trend started way back in 2013. The FX CPU isn't doing a great job either, but at least the game is much more playable compared to the i3 that has issues maintaining a stable frame time even when running in an open field. Next up, we have Far Cry 5, and at first it may seem like both CPUs are performing pretty much the same, though once we get into a vehicle and start driving around, we can see the FX processor beating the i3 when it comes to both frame rate and frame time performance. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next, where the i3 is having a hard time once again. Things refuse to load and PCs don't function properly or not appear at all, and some of the audio just doesn't work, which isn't the case with the FX-6300. Using DirectX 11, a lot of those issues get fixed, yet even then the game is more playable on the FX-6300. Now, to be honest, the FX processor doesn't necessarily deliver an amazing experience in this title either, but let's not forget that it has an unlocked multiplier, so we can always improve our performance. Next on the list is Battlefield 5, where the FX-6300 is at this point unsurprisingly beating the i3 by roughly 10 to 15 frames per second. The game also runs much smoother on the FX-6300, which is especially noticeable when looking at multiplayer results, where the i3 performs very poorly. Also, since the Intel processor is maxing out, there is a chance for some of the enemies to not get loaded up properly, so don't be surprised if you get killed by a floating gun. Next up, we have The Division 2, and guess what? The i3 is struggling here as well, while the FX-6300 is still doing perfectly fine 7 years after it was released. And I don't know about you, but it sounds pretty future-proof to me. Moving on, we have Call of Duty Warzone, and I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but the FX-6300 is once again outperforming the i3-3240 by around 5 to 10 frames, while also providing much better frame times. For our final game, we have Apex Legends, and performance in this game has been very inconsistent lately. I've played the game for a few hours on both CPUs, and all I can say is sometimes it runs pretty good, other times not so much, because of which I can't tell which one performs better. Overall though, I had a similar experience on both processors, so I'm just going to call this a tie, and hopefully this issue gets fixed soon, cause this is not how Apex used to run, at least on the FX-6300. Alright, let's have a look at thermal performance, and remember, we're using the stock coolers of these CPUs, and since I'm testing outside the case without any airflow, I also have an additional 120mm fan that is blowing onto the VRMs. Using Intel burn test, the i3-3240 maxes out at 64 degrees Celsius, while the FX-6300 has a maximum temperature of just 58 degrees, though keep in mind that the AMD stock cooler does run a bit louder. When it comes to motherboard temperatures, the Intel motherboard is easier to cool. Unfortunately, I don't have any temperature numbers for the Intel board, but the VRM heatsink doesn't even get that warm to the touch under full load. The AMD motherboard, on the other hand, does get warm, plus there's the Northbridge heatsink that also tends to heat up, though it's not as much of an issue, and according to hardware info, the VRMs on the 990 FXA board reach 49 degrees under full load, so I'm guessing the Intel board probably maxes out somewhere in between 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. Basically, you'll be fine without any extra airflow with the i3 system, unlike the FX-6300 that will need one fan to keep the VRM/Northbridge area cool. Finally, let's check out the power consumption, where the FX-6300 unsurprisingly loses. The FX processor consumes 63% more power at idle, 109% more using Intel burn test, 89% more when rendering a project in Vegas Pro, and finally 48% more power while gaming. So basically, if an i3 would be fine with a 300 watt power supply, you'd need 400 watts for the FX-6300. Okay, so just before we finish with this comparison, let's quickly talk about overclocking, which you can't really do with the i3-3240. Now, when I say overclocking, you probably start thinking about a better CPU cooler, better power supply, more airflow, etc., all of which is actually not needed to overclock the FX-6300. Using the exact same setup, I was able to overclock the 6-core FX to 4.16 GHz using 1.275 volts. I also overclocked the North Bridge frequency to 2190 MHz while the hypertransport is set to 2628 MHz. And of course, the RAM is pushed up to 2044 MHz. To be honest, most of the performance uplift is coming from the increased CPU as well as RAM clocks, which are really easy to achieve, so it's okay if you don't want to bother overclocking the North Bridge or hypertransport, because so far from what I've seen, the performance increase has been very minimal. Looking at Cinebench R15, we can see that with an overclock of 4.16 GHz, the FX-6300 still gets beaten by its competitor in single-core test by 22%, though when it comes to multi-core, the FX processor is now 63% faster. Using the Corona benchmark, we see the FX-6300 outperforming the i3 processor once again, and this time by 37%. In V-Ray, we now have an 89% advantage over the Intel processor, and even though the FX CPU is now performing 22% better than it did at stock using Intel burn test, the i3-3240 is still 20% ahead. When it comes to gaming, the FX-6300 now unsurprisingly pulls ahead even further than it did at stock, making already playable games even more playable. In Battlefield 4, the FX processor is now outperforming the i3 by around 30 frames. In Need for Speed, the overclocked FX processor almost never dips below 60 frames, unlike the i3 that has a hard time staying above 50 FPS. And finally, in Watch Dogs 2, we're just a couple hundred megahertz behind from breaking the 60 FPS barrier, at least when driving. You're probably now thinking, okay, well, overclocking increases power consumption and temps, and you'd be right, but since we're not really pushing things to their limits, it's not that big of an issue. Sure, the increase in CPU and VRM temps isn't small, and even though we don't want to be going any higher with our CPU temperature, the VRM temps are still very safe, and don't forget that this is what we're getting using Intel burn test. Power consumption hasn't increased much either. In fact, at idle we now consume less power, and it is basically the same while gaming. The highest increase in power consumption can be seen when using Vegas Pro and Intel burn test, where we have an uplift of 11 and 32% over stock, but other than that, there is absolutely no reason to be upgrading anything with a small overclock like this. Just by looking at these results, I honestly don't think AMD FX deserves the hate that it got. Sure, it has worse single-core, IPC is way behind. I mean, overall, it's just a weird architecture. But does it really matter? I don't think so, because despite all that, the FX-6300 has its own advantages and is comfortably beating the i3-3240 in nearly every single scenario. Gaming results surprised me the most, because I expected the i3 to perform better in older games, yet it turns out the i3 doesn't perform any better than the FX processor, even in supposedly single-threaded titles that released 7 to 8 years ago. In my opinion, the only couple of reasons you'd want to go with the i3 would be if you didn't care much about performance and just wanted an efficient processor to browse the web, play lightweight games and whatnot, or if you'd use it as a placeholder before upgrading to an i5 or an i7 later on. Now, you've probably heard that FX processors run better on Windows 10 than they do on 7, and I'm not sure whether that has anything to do with the results. So far, from what I've seen, the jump from Windows 7 to 10 doesn't always bring an improvement for AMD FX, And when it does, it's usually not that significant, so I doubt that Windows 10 improves performance that much. I will still probably make a comparison video though, cause I'd love to find that out myself, and let me know if you're interested as well. At the end of the day, the point I'm trying to make with this video, and the reason why I wanted to compare these two CPUs, is to show you that more cores can result in an overall better gaming experience, even if it's weak cores in the case of AMD FX, even if we talk about games that released 5 or more years ago. By the way, I have a lot more videos like this one coming, so if you're interested, you know what to do. Either way, thank you guys for watching. Feel free to check out more of my videos over here. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content, and I'll see y'all in the next one.